Hi, I'm Steve Holmes, Assistant Professor of Rhetoric at George Mason University. My talk today is taken from my current book project, Procedural Habits, which is looking at rhetorical and philosophical conceptions of habit and how they can help us rethink the role of embodiment in materiality in video games, virtual worlds, mobile media games, and things of that nature. With respect to this symposium's interest in defining digital rhetoric, mobile media app designers have offered us a new, if unorthodox, definition that is worth examining. Namely, the idea that habit formation constitutes a form of persuasion. Technology pundits heralded New Year's Day 2015 as the birth of the track everything revolution. Joining the archetypal Fitbit watches were new apps such as Apple Health, which monitors electrodermal activity, heart rate, and even blood alcohol content, and Vessel, a cup that tracks a user's beverage selection and displays nutritional content, which a few of you may have found useful last night, no judgment. While researchers have begun to examine the algorithmic norming of well-being, few have noted the ways in which rhetoric has been specifically invoked within these conversations. Across computer science and mobile media design journals, one finds a growing number of references to designer B.J. Fogg's concept of persuasive technology. Beyond rhetoric's historic roots in effective argumentation designed to produce an emotional response or conscious change in belief, Fogg claims that rhetoric should also include forms of non-conscious behavioral reinforcement monitored by computational algorithms and real-time feedback. As an illustration, consider the app It's Time to Eat. In the genre of Tamagotchi and Nintendogs, It's Time to Eat hopes to persuade children to make healthy eating choices by caring for a virtual pet. A user uploads a photograph of a meal to receive points. If a child uploads a picture of a donut, then the game's real-time response states, "Today's breakfast of donuts isn't great. Can you try something healthier tomorrow, like oatmeal with fruit?" Poor eating choices cause a user to lose pets and make the virtual pet unhappy. I didn't actually find out if you can kill the pet, but I hope they don't go that far. So let me offer a quick point of comparison to demonstrate how far from traditional conceptions of rhetoric Foggian persuasive technology takes us. In defining procedural rhetoric, Ian Bogost champions persuasive video games such as Mole Industries' Airport Security. According to Bogost, procedural rhetoric captures the unique ability of computationally expressive media to make persuasive arguments by modeling interactive real-life systems. In Airport Security, players control a TSA agent avatar to simulate the inevitable inaccuracies of quick bag searches. By analogy, one can imagine a designer using procedural rhetoric to create a persuasive game wherein a child has to click on different healthy or unhealthy foods for an avatar to eat while watching the avatar grow or decrease in body mass over time. By contrast, the designers of It's Time to Eat simply try to create the habit through gamified positive and negative reinforcement supported by behavioral economics. Specifically citing Fogg's influence, the designers refuse to start with the assumption that scare tactics, nutritional information, or interactive modeling is sufficient to motivate a change in eating habits. Rather, the designers assume that habits of diet can be produced as much through engaging a user's non-conscious affect, embodiment, and spatial situatedness with regard to mobile technology as through logic and argumentation. To offer one example, the designers take advantage of a user's pre-existing daily habits by sending push notifications about food choices before and after school hours, with particular emphasis on breakfast and snack time. In the present moment, I'd argue that the idea of a persuasive technology accurately characterizes a good deal of digital rhetoric. There are too many similar gamified or game-like persuasive technologies to list, including examples such as Habit RPG or Jane McGonigal's Super Better. Within industry discourses, Fogg's thinking has even generated derivative topoi such as prescriptive persuasion, as well as persistent designer links among persuasion, influence, nudge, and coercion. One also finds degrees of persuasive technologies beyond mobile media and gaming. Amazon's recommend feature or Google's PageRank, for instance, are some of Fogg's key examples of persuasive technologies. Amazon monitors the books we buy and suggests related books based upon our and other consumers' aggregated habits. Researchers have also documented non-digital forms, such as government efforts to correct citizens' habits through behavioral economics. If salt shakers are taken off of restaurant tables and diners have to go through the extra step of requesting a salt shaker from the waiter, then the government of Argentina argued in 2011 that they could make diners more conscious of the fact that adding salt to a meal is not a natural but a habituated practice. Such efforts are directly explained through Fogg's design heuristics, the behavior wizard, at the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab in what Fogg calls a blue dot behavior. The goal in removing salt shakers is to take an existing habit, the ability and desire to add salt to food, and to reduce the habit of consumption one time through a demotivator, having to ask the waiter or waitress for a salt shaker. The Argentine government sought to take advantage of humans' allegedly irrational default bias, an emotional desire to take the path of least resistance. So while there is a degree of Foucaultian biopower that does seem to undergird the current alignment of persuasion and habit formation, an equally as interesting aspect are the challenges that the rise of Foggian rhetoric poses for our broader conceptions of digital rhetoric. Across many definitions of digital rhetoric, starting with James P. Zappin, rhetoric remains the realm of argument, consciousness, or epistemology, and not non-conscious behavioral affect. Arguably, books such as Thomas Rickert's Ambient Rhetoric, Jeff Rice's Digital Detroit, Alex Reed's The Two Virtuals, Kristen Arola and Ann Wysocki's Composing Media, Composing Environment, or Laurie Gree's Still Life. So we're getting a few more, but these tend to remain exceptions rather than dominant paradigms within our fields. And this is for good reason. Rickert has convincingly demonstrated that it is no simple matter to extend rhetoric to materiality or embodiment, given rhetoric's historic focus on consciousness and language. Fogg's thinking of persuasive technology also reflects precisely this difficulty. While suggestive in granting habit a fundamental role in digital rhetoric, Fogg never explains or justifies how habits should be rhetorical, or, to put it in Kenneth Burke's terms, how we should reconceive of the relationship between symbolic action and non-symbolic motion. A number of game designers who have responded to Fogg have noted precisely this ambiguity. They complain that Fogg bizarrely juxtaposes a philosophical conception of rhetoric as style with a simultaneous view of rhetoric as a form of deterministic operant conditioning that is bolstered by vague or superficial appeals to behavioral psychology and behavioral economics. To offer an obvious criticism of Fogg, the progressive education theorist Alfie Kohn cites empirical research to argue that gamified and external forms of computational monitoring actually demotivate individuals over the long run. In persuasive games, Bogos draws an absolute division between behavior change and rhetoric, stating, perhaps Fogg's tools offer valid ways of using technology to alter behavior, but not one of them deploys rhetoric. Instead, all of Fogg's techniques use technology to alter actions or beliefs without engaging users in a discourse about the behavior itself or the logics that would recommend such actions or beliefs. In their discussion of barter, an app designed to persuade Britons to spend locally, the designers similarly complain of Fogg. The issue of whether the techniques of so-called persuasion are indeed manipulative has escaped serious scrutiny within the computing community. Now, while I fully agree with the idea that Fogg's thinking has issues, I cannot help but hear the voice of Plato's Socrates, rejecting bad rhetoric as sophistry, dissimulation, or trickery from good rhetoric in game and app designers' purpose of retaining the power of rhetoric while rejecting certain species of the genus rhetoric as a priori bad. Indeed, despite his strong endorsement of rhetoric, Bogost has more recently attacked other habit-changing apps like Habit RPG, or my personal favorite, and forgive the language, Go Fucking Do It, which charges users money for not performing the preset habit. Bogos uses the metaphor of snake oil to discuss these types of apps. Gamification, another impoverished manifestation of Bogos' ideal eidetic form of procedural rhetoric and persuasive games, is similarly discussed as bullshit, another common synonym for sophistry. So Bogos and other game designers are undeniably correct to be wary of narrow corporate agendas for persuasive technologies. There is also, I fully agree, a strategic need to claim that video games are capable of more complex rhetorical expressions than mere gamification or positive and negative behavioral reinforcement. Nevertheless, regardless of the particular rhetorical causes they might be pressed into, procedural rhetoric is a priori good, and persuasive technologies are a priori bad. This division neatly accords to what Richard Lanham called the weak defensive rhetoric, and I'll give a shout out to Nathaniel Rivers for this because I totally ripped off his discussion of this. Good job, Nathaniel. The weak defense reduces rhetoric to style, making rhetoric capable of untruth, pandering, and manipulation. The weak defense stems from Plato and Isocrates and most humanists. Good people use good rhetoric for good causes, while the bad kind of rhetoric is employed in bad causes. There exists an unchanging logical approach to reality, the logos, an arhetorical realm to which rhetoric is measured. Among designer discourses, the weak defense functions in this case to marginalize Fogg's unintentionally significant contribution to current discussions of digital rhetoric. That is, the simple idea that habit formation and embodiment should have a central role. An argument I believe resonates quite well with rhetoric's emerging interest in ambient rhetoric, Bruno Latour, ecology, materiality, and non-human agency. What I'd argue needs to change are Fogg's definitions of rhetoric and his definitions of habit, a redefinition that the remainder of my talk will begin to outline today. It is paradoxically in one of the most open-ended of habit monitoring apps that best reveals the Foggian definition of habit, McGonagall's SuperBetter. SuperBetter allows a user to determine his or her own health habits to improve through gamification, working towards a meta-habit of resiliency. McGonagall tellingly describes habit formation through the metaphor of error correction. SuperBetter's website instructs a user to devote time to debugging your own software, imploring users to fix your own code. In figuring habit as an obstacle that is produced by a machine-like body that interferes with an otherwise properly functioning individual who possesses an innate sense of resiliency, and therefore who does not require the intervention of a persuasive technology, SuperBetter invokes a conception of habit found in post-Cartesian and post-Enlightenment philosophers such as Immanuel Kant. Kant exclusively discussed habit through an ontological division between a mechanistic body, necessity, and transcendental mind, freedom. Kant argues that habit could only be, in his words, a physical inner necessitation to continue behaving in the same way we have behaved because it detracts from our freedom of mind. Moreover, it leads to thoughtless repetition of the same action, mechanical uniformity, and so becomes ridiculous. As a rule, all habits are objectionable. By definition, habits are non-rational and non-logical and form part of our self-incurred tutelage in Kant's phrasing. Kant gives voice, actually, to our common sense understanding of habit as a mindless routine, the so-called mechanistic paradigm of habit, where the thinking self seeks to become externalized from its embodied environments. Why else would a user, after all, want a persuasive app to improve his or her bad, unthinking habits, except to form better habits that don't interfere with the cogito's ability to realize its transcendental freedom? However, Kant offers only one way to think about habit. In fact, the relationship between habit and rhetoric is much older than its current mechanistic emergence in persuasive technologies. Ethos for many in digital rhetoric remains an instrumental artistic proof or a constructed persona, like the TSA agent avatar that the player takes on in airport security. Rhetoric, like habit, is something added to a pre-existing and fixed digital rhetoric. By contrast, Michael J. Hyde, Christy S. Fleckenstein, Jody Nicotra, and others have pointed out that ethos also designated social and physical practices of habituation that provide cohesion to a fluidly emerging and unstable self. Invoking pre-Platonic understandings of nature as species, Hyde writes, abiding by this more primordial meaning of the term, one can understand the phrase, the ethos of rhetoric, to refer to the way discourse is used to transform space and time into dwelling place, thea, where people can deliberate about and know together some matter of interest. Such places define the grounds, the abodes, or habitats where a person's ethics and moral character take form and develop. Even at a basic level, Hyde's claim makes a great deal of sense. Contemporary neuropsychology shows that humans are habitual creatures, with approximately 45% of our everyday behaviors tending to be repeated in the same location almost every day, although for academics, it's probably more like 80%. According to Aristotle and the great philosophers Calvin and Hobbes, habituation cultivates hexes, a term often translated as bodily comportment, state, or disposition. As a genus of moral virtue, a hexis is not a mechanistic habit in Kant's sense, but the disposition that arises from repeated activities, energeia, and thus is something that cannot come about by nature, but only through repetition. Hexis is derived from the Greek verb echein, or echein, which means to have or possess in the sense of an active having. A hexis is what produces a virtuous action, but it is not commensurate with the completed action. Rather, the hexis are the cultivated basis for orienting oneself toward virtuous activities in varied circumstances. To paraphrase Socrates' example from the Republic, a good ethical habit is to return what one has borrowed. But this does not necessarily mean that a virtuous person should return a borrowed weapon to a convicted murderer. In bodily arts, Deborah Haughey cites M.A. Wright's interpretation of Aristotle's line, Empedocles says that those who change their bodily conditions, hexine, deem to change their thought, phronesine. To claim, in Haughey's words, hexis equals thought. Thought does not just happen within the body, it happens as the body. In making this claim, Haughey argues that bodily comportment, disposition, or training does not merely supplement thought by eliminating bad mechanistic habits in Kant's sense. Contra Bogos' insistence that habit has no role in persuasion, hexis indicates that habit co-constitutes or shapes our mode of being in the world. While they seldom connect such concerns to rhetoric, this understanding of hexis and habit is hardly news to many post-human media studies scholars. Echoing work by Walter J. Ong, Damasio, Malabo, Andy Clark, and others, Catherine Hale's comments, research indicates that the small habitual actions associated with web interactions, clicking the mouse, moving a cursor, etc., may be extraordinarily effective in retraining, or more accurately, repurposing our neural circuitry, so that changes are not only psychological, but physical as well. Hale's suggestion can be taken to support the idea that our neural structures can be seen as a collection of crystallized or fossilized habits of the many communication, reading, and play practices that structure our daily lives. Across these examples, from Aristotle to the present, habits are not simply externalized entities to be manipulated by persuasive technologies or obstacles to consciousness, but form part of what Rickert, via Diane Davis, calls rhetorical ontology, a pre-symbolic relation to the material world that serves as a condition of possibility for digital rhetoric. Yet, and this is something Haughey tends to gloss over a little bit in endorsing Wright's hexis equals thought claim. Habit, nevertheless, remains a very unique form of being in the world. For Aristotle, the hexis are mostly positive in the sense of enabling virtuous dispositions. However, subsequent commentators on Aristotelian hexis have noted that habit never ultimately loses its relation to Kantian mechanism, as anyone who has ever driven a car on autopilot for a few minutes can attest to. The 19th century French philosopher Félix Ravaisson's recently translated essay of Habit, which influenced subsequent treatments of habit by Bergson, Merleau-Ponty, and Deleuze, and others, perhaps best explores this dimension of hexis. Ravaisson situates hexis within a complex organismic goal of Darwinian self-organization to make energy and thought expenditure easier. Drawing on what he called via Joseph Butler the double law of habit, Ravaisson argues that the repetition necessary to form an effective, energy-conserving habit means that sensation and passive impressions of the habit grow weaker. Simply put, when a habit emerges, the brain stops fully participating in directing action. Thus, we tend to actualize repeated actions without thinking, as habitual dispositions take hold when cued by the habituated ecologies that we immerse ourselves within for the comfort and ease of living. Habit, as Ravaisson puts it, becomes an unreflective spontaneity that establishes itself beneath the region of will, personality, and consciousness. Hexis may produce our actualized dispositions towards the good life, but this disposition, he argues, is only achieved through a constant interplay between conscious and non-conscious forces, actuality and potentiality. Habit is thus, to borrow Ravaisson's quotation from Pierre Maine de Buran, habit is the general cause of our progress on the one hand and of our blindness on the other. Indeed, Derrida's comments about the pharmacological nature of writing applies equally as well to Ravaisson's habit. To repeat without knowing. To sum up, if habit cannot be so easily separated from digital rhetoric, our common questions such as, what do digital symbols mean rhetorically, can also benefit from asking, what is the nature of the human who engages with digital symbols through technologies, media, ecologies, and habits? So in an era when Foggian rhetorics increasingly seek to produce norms of habit and conduct, habit's ontological character, by contrast, does not necessarily seek to order or regulate habits alone, but rather shows us another dimension to habit beyond current attempts to fix it as a political object for bad rhetoric or social manipulation. Ultimately, this framework constitutes a first step, I hope, towards supporting and developing alternative modes of hex use of being beyond those that accord to the narrow utilitarian aims that many persuasive technologies in the present moment are pressed into. So habit as ontology importantly demonstrates that the digital habits that we develop are not permanent. They remain our second nature, as Aristotle called them, and we can modify non-conscious procedures through actions in a way that alters how we perform the rituals and routines of everyday life, the complex ways in which we dwell with digital rhetoric. Thank you.